Well, I'm joined once again now by Alison Sargent for a second look through the day's papers. Alison, you're starting with that visit of those three prime ministers from Eastern Europe to the Ukrainian capital on Tuesday.
Now, the Polish and Czech papers seem quite proud of this mission. Polish tabloid Fact calls it a courageous trip to Ukraine. They write that the leaders left at dawn to take the train to Kyiv. The trip was kept top secret, only announced when they were already across the border. Czech paper Dnes, meanwhile, calls the visit a strong expression of support for Ukraine. It is worth pointing out, though, that that support is pretty much just symbolic, although it is a rather strong symbol. The paper notes that this is the first trip to Kyiv by any foreign leaders since the Russian invasion began. And finally, Aaron, a German paper, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, notes that according to Poland, the trip was coordinated very closely with the EU. Now, with that in mind, the paper is wondering if the EU leaders, Charles Michel and Ursula von der Leyen, maybe didn't, quote, have the guts to make the trip themselves.
So, Alison, while those three leaders were taking the train into Ukraine, thousands of others were leaving in the opposite direction. As of the latest count now from the UN, some 3 million and counting have fled.
And there's a cartoon on the front page of Swiss paper Le Temps that sort of reflects that double standard that many people have been pointing out about the way mostly white Ukrainian refugees have been treated compared to refugees from Africa or the Middle East. This cartoon is by Patrick Chappatte. That welcome banner there reads, "We are all Ukrainians," but then that local official is saying to this man, "Not you." The paper's editorial also addresses this issue. It concludes, quote, "This crisis should make us think deeply about how we welcome other refugees from more distant conflicts. They too deserve true protection." And speaking of those other conflicts, Tuesday marked the 11th anniversary of the start of the uprising that led to the war in Syria. We read here in The Guardian that people in the rebel enclave Idlib marked that anniversary with one of their largest rallies in months. Many expressed their hope that the invasion of Ukraine will renew interest in their cause, because in the words of one Syrian that we see in this headline here, the enemy is the same. Russia, of course, is the main backer of the Syrian regime. One medic from Idlib also had advice for Ukrainians. They said, "Fortify your hospitals with cement blocks. The enemy, Putin, does not distinguish between civilians, wounded people, and fighters."
All right, Alison, let's change gears again. Head to France, to the island of Corsica, more specifically, where there have been 2 weeks of violent protests over the prison attack of a well-known Corsican nationalist.
Yeah, and France's interior minister is headed to Corsica today to try and calm the tension there. Gérald Darmanin gave an interview to the local paper, Corse Matin. He says notably that France is prepared to go so far as to grant autonomy to Corsica, but then he gets kind of vague. He says what autonomy actually means is going to need to be discussed. He also said that he does want to shed light on what happened to that Corsican nationalist, Ivan Colonna, how he came to get attacked in prison. He is serving a life sentence for his involvement in the murder of a French official back in 1998.
All right, Alison, but many papers seem to be skeptical about how much Gérald Darmanin's visit will change things.
Yeah, the Huffington Post calls it a last chance mission for the French government. The website notes that despite Emmanuel Macron suggesting as a candidate that he was open to the demands of Corsican nationalists, that quickly proved to be just an illusion. According to the Huffington Post, his government has made little progress on that issue in the past 5 years. The demands of Corsican nationalists remain the same. They include autonomy, but also making Corsican an official language and transferring Corsican nationalist prisoners like Colonna to prisons on the island of Corsica. The Huffington Post writes that the attack against him was like a spark on a barrel of oil that had been filling up for 5 years. The Courrier International, meanwhile, has rounded up some analysis from papers outside of France. The outlook, Aaron, I have to say, pretty grim. Catalan paper La Vanguardia writes that the Corsican unrest is a serious problem for France that has never gone away. Meanwhile, an Algerian website points out that the majority of presidential candidates have really stayed silent about that issue. Interesting to see if that ends up changing in the coming days.
All right, Alison, let's turn to some historic news. For the first time, an African architect has been awarded the profession's most prestigious prize.
This is the Pritzker Prize, basically the Nobel of architecture. It was awarded to Diébédo Francis Kéré of Burkina Faso, though he's lived in Germany for many years. The Burkinabe paper, L'Observateur Palga, writes that while until yesterday, many people in Burkina Faso hadn't actually heard of him or of the Pritzker Prize, well, they still say his global recognition shines on the country like an invigorating ray of light. The Guardian, meanwhile, writes that few architects have had such a fast rise against such odds. They note that he began his career by building a mud brick school for his community. Less than 15 years later, he designed Burkina Faso's new national parliament. We see him pictured here in front of one of his buildings that's in London's Hyde Park. The Guardian actually spoke to Kéré, and while he didn't want to talk about racism directly, he said, you know, this is a field where you need a lot of resources. You really need to be strong and lucky. And he said he hopes that young people in Africa will see him and know that this is a possible path for them too.
Indeed. Alison, thank you very much for that press review.